Stanford University.
Absolutely wonderful to be back here. I just spent the whole day talking about oil and gas work, and this is a much more positive talk to give. So the title of the talk is Making Large-Scale Solar Work, and Why Would We Want to? And this was really the topic of this forum that I chaired a couple of weeks ago. But before I talk, I just want to give some credit to other people here at Stanford who were very instrumental in making this forum really a great success, and that's the Woods Institute of the Environment, it's the Precooler Institute of Energy, and we see some Woods people here like Mike McMurphy, who's helping out a lot, Jeff and Buzz and Lynn Orr, who helped sponsor this, and then my colleagues Sally Benson, Stacy Bent, Bruce Clemens, and others. Let's start with thinking a little bit about why solar. I mean, I can obviously give this talk and tell you, well, I'm not sure if we want to do solar. Of course, I'm a really big proponent of solar energy. And you can argue with me after the talk, but not right now. Okay, so we're just going to assume solar is a really good thing to go for. And here is one of the reasons why I think so. Looking at what the world supplies us in terms of a resource assessment, solar is by far the most abundant resource that we have. Here there's a bit of an energy diagram inspired by the Big Sur, Southern California coast landscape. And you see several other areas, also some areas that I work in, for example, ocean energy. Wind is marked here. Good, so I can actually tell him solar is better than wind. Otherwise, he will start arguing with me straight away. Hydro, and this is biofuels. I usually label that as photosynthesis because really that's what it does. And geothermal, and then nuclear, but Burton is going to talk about it next week, so I left out the numbers. He will fill them in for you next week. But you see two numbers here for each of these resources. The first number is an estimate, and these are very rough estimates, so it's a ballpark figure on how much at any given time we get from that resource in the world, on Earth, that we could potentially use and extract. And this is a factor of the energy that we need. So if you see for wind the number 45 here, it means that wind, if we could extract everything that's technologically possible to extract, it would give us 45 times what we need in the world in energy at any particular time period. Okay, so that seems a lot, of course. If you want to extract it, you would not want to pave 1/45th part of the world with wind turbines, although Mark would argue against that. But the bigger that number, of course, the nicer the resource would be. The second number is the fraction of the world energy that we currently get from this resource. Okay, so these numbers are pretty small in most cases, except for the number here for hydro, which is really quite close to what we think is technologically available. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why we generally talk about hydro as being maxed out. But what I really want you to focus on is this really big number here for solar, and that's 4,000. Now people argue about it, whether that's 1,000 or 9,000 or maybe 900, but for me it doesn't really matter. 1,000 is a big factor, and so this sounds pretty good to me. So if you start thinking about sustaining or supplying the world with energy in a sustainable manner, in a manner that is scalable, so that if our energy needs grow, this can easily grow without too much extra trouble, it seems that solar really is our resource. And of course, it's renewable. Now, where is the solar energy? Insolation, so the amount of energy that we get per square meter per year, that's normally how we look at it, or per day, is not uniformly distributed. Here is an insolation map of the world. the lighter the area, especially these bright yellow spots, the better the resource. And as I said here, a really excellent large-scale solar resource is rated at approximately 2,500 kilowatt hour per square meter per year that you get out. Sometimes you see it given in kilowatt hour per square meter per day, so you have to do this conversion. But that's about a DNI, a direct normal insolation number of about 7.5 in terms of the day value. Okay? So if you look at the light yellow areas, you certainly see that the country where I grew up, Holland, is not particularly attractive because it's purple. Funnily enough, Germany is not either, but Germany has a lot of solar and also larger solar installations, so that's interesting. But certainly here in the southwest, and we'll see this on the next picture too, the resource is fantastic. And just to throw you off, here the colors are the other way around. So here the darker the better. And also to throw you off, here it's in the day value, okay? But the top rate is really this, maybe DNI above 7.5 based on the day value. So we see we have a wonderful, wonderful resource here in the southwest. And of course, you know this because Southern California, Mojave Desert, is usually given as the prime example. Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, all really good areas. Now, how good is this really? So let's do a little calculation. And again, these are just ballpark figures where we filter the DNI that we have, and we only look at resources that are 6.75 or higher. Pretty good DNI. We look at areas that have very little slope in the land, okay, so it's pretty flat, and so installations are easier, it's more uniform, okay, so we throw out all the mountain areas. We don't look at protected areas, we don't look at urban areas, we don't look at water areas, we don't look at areas that are highly fragmented. So in this case, I think in the calculations we use that at least there should be 5 square kilometers of contiguous space to put a solar installation on. Okay? So if you take all that into account and then you look at the western US and you see how much we have, it seems that the total gross resource for solar is about 6.5 million megawatts. That may not mean much to you, but our total US consumption of energy is 3 million megawatts approximately. So we could power all of our US energy needs with this resource in the western US. If you start looking at how much land would be required, and now we can start arguing because it depends on, you know, how much you look in terms of efficiency. So here is a pretty optimistic one. You say, well, if I have a large-scale solar installation, the efficiency of these installations is pretty high. We'll see that later on. I look at, say, a 6.75 DNI here. That corresponds to about 275 watts per square meter. Say that I have 40% efficiency. It's a little bit on the optimistic side, but hey, I wanted this number to come out nice. Actually, I wanted 100 by 100 square miles, and I said, well, what efficiency would I need in order to get that? And that's about 40%, okay? But if it's 20% now or 15%, no, that's not a huge difference here, okay? So we're not looking at an incredibly large area that we would need to power all of the United States, not just electricity needs, but everything, okay? Which of course we won't do. So that puts it a little bit in perspective. Okay, so now let's have a look at what sort of interesting devices people have developed, and this is where it gets really exciting, I think, anyway, because I love these large-scale projects. I love big wind turbines and big tidal turbines. We talked about tidal turbines a while ago, and I like these devices also. So the old workhorse of this industry is the parabolic trough. And here are some pictures. I don't know how well you can see this, but here's a couple of guys walking in between those troughs. So these troughs are pretty large. Very simple idea. There's some, say, a pipe or a collector here in the focal point of these parabolic troughs. There's a liquid going through, for example, an oil. The rays of the sun that come in are reflected and concentrated right at that point. And so there's a concentration there of solar energy. It heats up this oil, and now we've got heat, and we can start driving using a normal Rankine type cycle. We can create steam, we can start driving a turbine. Okay? So right at this point we have heat like we would also have in a gas-fired or coal-fired power plant. Okay? Now, of course, as a mathematician, I look at this and say, oh, this is wonderful, because as the sun starts moving, obviously the rays and the reflection is a little bit different, so there's some optimization problems here. How should I position these troughs? Do I need to turn them? Do I need to reposition the collector, and so on? So there's a lot of interesting mathematics here and tracking, but people have worked on this for quite a long time. One thing, of course, is with one of these parabolic troughs is you have to be pretty particular about the shape of this trough. If you don't have the right shape, it doesn't work so well. And it's quite expensive to create troughs like this, so they looked for cheaper alternatives. And one of them is what they call a linear Fresnel or a compact linear Fresnel system, where you basically, you don't do the curve, but you take it, divide it into little pieces, and each of these pieces are flat. They're easier to manufacture. Now you have a lot of little pieces rather than one contiguous piece that you now have to position and optimize, but you can do this using automated controls. Okay, so that generally reduces the cost. The concentration of these troughs, so the concentration of the solar energy is a factor 10 to 50, depends a little bit on the design. If you had a dish, so not just a trough, but actually a whole dish that reflects, you can get much higher concentration, 30 to 1,000. And the maximum temperature you can achieve is, again, approximate numbers, about 400 degrees centigrade, much higher for the dish. The higher the temperature, the more efficient this is for your thermal plant. And one of the interesting things is that the efficiencies are pretty high here, 55%, 75% type of efficiencies. So this is one. Yeah?
So the efficiency that you mentioned, is the efficiency taking the solar energy to heat?
That's right.
Or
yeah, to the heat, just to the heat. And then, of course, you've got an energy loss for the turbine and so on. Okay, but that's just the heat generation here. Now, one of the immediate questions you may ask yourself is, well, it depends on having the sun shine on this trough. And so what do you do if you have intermittency, if there's a cloud, and so on? So let me immediately introduce the concept of storage associated with this. And here is a schematic of a solar millennium plant that has storage. I included, for those of you who look at the slides later on, a link to the website where they actually, Solar Millennium made a very nice animation where you can see all this happening. But here's a schematic. We've got the solar installation right here. Ignore this for now. Normally, it goes to a heat exchanger, so there may be oil in this system here. The oil comes to a heat exchanger. There's a water cycle here. Cold water comes into the heat exchanger, generates steam, goes through the turbine, is brought to a cooling tower and condenses and put back in this heat exchanger here. Okay? So that's the very simple form. If you want to put some storage in, then you could take an inner loop here. If there's enough electricity or enough heat generated, more than enough to drive the turbine, then you can take a little bit of that and you can start heating up a storage system. And in this case, what they've done is they use salt, molten salt. So here is a pot of cold molten salt, the cold salt, and here is hot. And so if you have a little bit extra, you put it through this heat exchanger, which is an oil-salt heat exchanger, and you take cold salt, move it through, and then store it in the hot molten salt storage tank. Now, the nice thing about this is that when the sun goes down, or the sun disappears, and you don't have enough coming from the parabolic trough field directly to the turbine, then you can revert this and say, okay, I need a little bit more, so let's help with this hot stored, this stored energy that I have in the hot tank, and then you revert this and you put it through here, and you have this heat exchanger, and then it goes to here. And you can do that same thing at night. Okay, so the idea is that in this case, in this way, you have a 24/7 power plant. Okay. The one that they've installed has approximately 6 hours worth of storage. Because these systems are relatively new, this particular one only got into operation last year in 2009. We don't really have actual production data, so I cannot tell you how well this works in practice. But I just want to tell you there are ideas there, and they're relatively new technologies, and we can hopefully, and I mean, that's why we're here for, we can help also improve these things. So I'm pretty optimistic about this in the future. So there's some other much nicer looking systems, I think. One is the tower system. And this is an interesting one because the one project that people talk about a lot right now in California, and we'll see this later, is the Ivanpah project that is built by BrightSource. And this is one of those tower systems. So now I've got a big, very high tower. In some cases, they could be 100 meters high. Okay, so the pretty big systems here with a solar boiler. And it's the same sort of principle. You have a whole bunch of heliostats, thousands of them, so slanted mirrors that again reflect this light, but now onto the solar boiler. And because you have so many mirrors around it, the temperatures that you create there, the solar boiler, are very much higher than you have with a parabolic trough or a linear Fresnel. Okay? And when you have higher temperatures, the maximum temperature of some of these projects is 2,000 degrees centigrade, and you have a higher efficiency. Okay, so this is one of the advantages of this. I think they look spectacular. Here's a photo from PS10, which is a plant that was built in Spain. But other people like the parabolic trough better because they're not as easy to see when you're driving around, for example. Of course, these things you'll see very clearly because they're very, very large towers, and they're also very bright when all that light comes in. One of the advantages of this, though, is that when you put these guys in, you can have a rougher surface area, and you don't need to grade the surface as much as you would with a parabolic trough. Okay? And so they say, well, then we don't actually affect the actual surface here as much as we would with the other areas for so many acres. And here is another system. These are called dish systems or Stirling dishes. For those of you who know a little bit about engines, the previous ones were all based on a Rankine cycle. These ones are Stirling engines. Okay, so they use compression and expansion to drive a piston, and then create whatever you want to create out of that. Okay, and I love these designs. Pretty futuristic, all still in the prototype phase, but there are a couple of big projects suggested based on this technology. Now, an interesting thing is when you start looking around, you feel that large-scale solar is a new thing because everybody starts talking about it now, and siting issues and transmission issues, but really has been around for quite a long time. It started in the early 80s, and in fact, the largest large-scale solar plant that we have in the world is right here in California near Barstow, and those are the SEGs 1 through 9. They're operated by NextEra. There are 9 different plants all close together, Kramer Junction, Barstow area, between 13 megawatts and 80 megawatts, and they've been operated there for way over 20 years. Okay? So it's been around for a while. So here in this case, the circles are parabolic troughs. The crosses are tower installations. There's a couple of those also. We had 2 in California, Solar 1 and Solar 2. This one, Solar 2, is being commissioned and is now a telescope area, or a radio telescope. So that's interesting, and UC Davis got this. But recently, 2 have been built by Abengoa in Spain, PS10, 10 megawatt project, and PS20. And just to give you one sort of idea here, this is a 20 megawatt site, so not that big. It's 162 meter high, the tower, and there's 1,255 heliostats. So these are pretty big things to build. Some bigger troughs built recently also, but really not very much. Solar Millennium has built one now in Spain, 50 megawatt, and the Sol 1 that was just started in 2009, was opened in 2009. And there was a lot of hoopla in the newspaper about this, right, 50 megawatt. But hey, we've had 80 megawatts in California already for 20 years. And then there was one about 64 megawatts built in Nevada. There is also a linear Fresnel one. It's 5 megawatts called Kimberlina, operated by Ausra here in California. But what is interesting when you look at this, say, hey, we had all this activity in the 80s, and then pretty much was quiet for a while. Okay, so when you think about it, say, well, have we been sleeping, right? I mean, why? How come that this didn't take off? And it's not that we haven't been building energy systems since the 80s. Here is the US past consumption, and you see that coal, there's plenty of new coal-fired power plants that have been built. Nuclear energy increased in that time. Gas as well, if you look at the gas here. So we've built a lot of infrastructure, we built a lot of power plants. Of course, you know, we've been through lots of investments in biofuels. We've looked at hydrogen for a while. So there's been lots of stuff going on, but not solar. If you look at the R&D investments from the government in solar, they've been very low. So, let's go back. So what caused this? You know, what happened? And most of the people say, well, of course, it was cost. It was just too costly. Well, it depends on how many subsidies you want to give, etc. Part of it, of course, was also politics, vested interest, and just in general, very little stimulation from the government, from federal. Not just here, but also in other places. Germany and Spain then several years ago started really pushing for it. And then we woke up also in the United States. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that, what's been happening now. There have been two acts, the 2008 Energy Improvement and Extension Act, and then the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that really helped push some of this solar to the foreground again. And here are some of the things that are available right now. This is the reason why at the moment there is so much to do about it. And this is the 30% federal grant for new commercial plants. And there's no cap on that. So you get a lot of money in support of a new commercial project, even a very large one. But the one caveat is that at the moment, this is only going to be given to you if you break ground before the end of 2010. So that means that you have to go through your permitting process, you have to get your financing in place, etc., before the end of this year. And this is one of the reasons why agencies like the California Energy Commission are very, very busy right now evaluating all these prospects. For investors like ourselves, you know, if we want to put PV systems and so on, there is a normal 30% investment tax credit that has now been extended to 2016. And in the past, these sort of investment tax credits were very unstable. We would have it for maybe a year, we'd have to go through Congress again, and hopefully it would be extended again. But now it's been fixed. In 2008, it was fixed for 8 years. And that has really helped stabilize the market and has really made a lot of the companies more courageous. We also have something called the makers, or the some people refer to them as marks, but really the C is before the R. That's the Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System. And this basically means that in a lot of the cases, a large investor can have accelerated depreciation, sometimes 50% depreciation in the first year, to recover investments more quickly. That's very attractive for investors. But this, in order to use this, you had to break ground in 2009. And then we have CREBs, Clean Renewable Energy Bonds. That was low-cost financing for public entities. And then the other thing is, which is really important for the large-scale solar project, is there is money for loan guarantee programs. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So what is happening now is this incredible rush, which I call the solar rush, where everybody is putting forward new projects, and some of them are really quite large. So I've done it here per manufacturer or developer. Next Era, as you know, already has a couple of projects. They're running that California project that we have, the SAGS projects. Suggested several here, just 3 of them. Beacon and Genesis are 2 projects that are currently being fast-tracked. Beacon is on used old agricultural land, and Genesis is on federal land that is governed by the Bureau of Land Management, BLM land. Okay, so different types of land. Solar Millennium is looking at a really big system, 1,000 megawatts near Blythe. Abengoa, Spanish company, is looking also in California, in the Mojave Desert. It's looking in Arizona, in Gila Bend, the Solano projects, which people have talked about a lot. They had a lot of trouble getting financing for this, but it was one of the earlier projects. And then they're also building in Spain. First Solar, which is not a CSP, a concentrated solar power company, but a thin film PV. And Mike, a while ago, when he gave his talk, he talked about their thin film technology. They're trying to build really big systems. They're thinking about Desert Sunlight, which is in collaboration with Southern California Edison and PG&E. Both get about half of this in Southern California. And they're also trying very hard to get a deal for 2,000 megawatt thin film PV system in Inner Mongolia. And this is one thing that we really need to keep an eye on the Chinese here, because they're really investing an incredible amount of money in solar, PV, but now also CSP. All of this is still being negotiated, and it hasn't really been in the news, but I'm sure something will happen there. Bright Source, Ivanpah, we'll see this a little bit later. And then the Sterling Energy Systems, the dish systems, there are also 2 projects, really big projects proposed, Imperial Valley and Calico Solar. So, but they all need to be permitted, and not all of them can be fast-tracked. And so let's see what we can do. So just to go back to this, you can just imagine that if you have this deadline for 2010, then a lot of stuff is happening. There are environmental organizations that are really worried about the impact on the land. There's industry really trying to push this forward, saying if we don't do it this year, it will be really difficult for the industry to get a foothold and to develop. So there's the policymakers and the agencies that are saying, ho, but we need to do everything according to regulations. And then the regulations were not really developed for large-scale solar projects, but really for other types of projects. So there's an incredible amount happening, and it hasn't always been so friendly. So when I started thinking about this and looking at this last year, there was a lot of conflict. And one of the things that we thought through Woods is, why don't we see if we can maybe help out, get these stakeholders in the same room, force them to talk to each other in small groups, and actually be friendly to each other, and then see if maybe we can help, at least for us also, to help us understand a little bit better what's going on, what the major issues are, and see how we can help, and maybe these sort of discussions would help. So that's what we did just a few weeks ago at the Woods Precooler Large-Scale Solar Technology and Policy Forum. So we brought together non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations, but also organizations like Vote Solar here in San Francisco, like CERT in Sacramento, who are very much on the policy front, not necessarily only environmental. But the Defenders of Wildlife, for example, was another one that came in. The NRDC was there, Freedom to Roam, and several others. We had industry players, a lot of the industries that you've heard about already. We had some policymakers and agencies, some foundations, Energy Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, Sea Change. They have a lot of experience working in this field. And so they bring some really good information. And then it says, it says scientist. There should be an S here. Okay, there's more than one. Okay, we brought some scientists in as well. Okay, and these were sort of the main questions that we wanted them to talk about. What are the main challenges according to you? Which of these are most critical? What can we do to move forward? And what can you bring to the table? And what do you need? Okay, let's just see if we can get them together. So let's talk a little bit about what they were saying. So first of all, a perspective from an independent system operator. This was somebody from CAISO. So just a couple of ideas of what they sort of see as the big problems, and you start seeing themes develop here. They immediately came up and said, we have a really bad regulatory framework. It's absolutely terrible. Those were words, especially in California. It's a mess. You go through umpteen different authorities or authorization levels to get your permitting process. Then you have to go somewhere else again to do something else. And then you have to go here to get another permit. And it's just terrible. So for them, it's also really unclear who needs to build, who can use it, who pays for it? Who earns money of it just for transmission for these system operators? The other thing that they brought up is today's transmission is not fully utilized. Very often they say, hey, if you have a large-scale solar project and it is in a remote location, we have to build a transmission line. That's very costly. But when you start looking at transmission systems, you say, well, one of the problems we already have is that these systems are not fully utilized. And one of the problems is that we do not have common communications either. So if you look at different states, some of the states like California dispatches every 5 minutes, other states may dispatch hourly. So communication and optimization of existing transmission lines is a little hard. They really saw the urge to accelerate site selection processes, and they talked a lot about weather, because for them that's a problem. Now, if there is intermittency, then you need to have ramping capability. And the ISO needs to take care of that. And at the moment, they say they need about 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of ramping capability. Where does that come from? Can we actually create incentives to get this from more efficient renewable mechanisms? Then we went to industry, and this is basically it. The industry perspective is the regulatory framework is a complete mess. And this is their view on what they have to go through in order to get a full permission for a new project. Okay, so there's no point going on this, but I just want to see there's lots of players, there's lots of arrows, and it's a general mess. So that was their big thing. The NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, like environmental organizations, they said, well, no, we are, of course, very worried about the environment. So we want to look at the environmentally least sensitive sites. So we need to have good site selection. But they also were saying, well, it's no wonder we're facing problems. We're trying to do things that are very large scale, very, very fast. Okay? So we want to push this through. There's conflicting interests also for land use. I mean, you always have this. Decision-making institutions that we have to talk to are designed for completely different purposes. And currently, there are no drivers to lead any coordinated process. Nobody is trying to come up with general rules and say, this is how we're going to do it, this is how we should be communicating together. Another thing that they brought up is that very, very difficult for them to argue with industry or policymakers or agencies about costs. Now, is there a level playing field? Are we comparing apples and pears? Really, really difficult. Cost for something like this, a very capital intense, right? The fuel is free. It's all capital investment. So if you can get a good deal in equity, then the costs are much lower than if you have to pay a lot of interest. So difficult. And they were just hammering an integrated resource approach for this also. So when we started looking at all of these things that came up, then we realized really our the main issues that they brought up really should be divided into different timescales. We've got some very critical short-term issues, we've got some near medium-term issues, and we have some long-term issues. So in the short term, it's all about these pipeline projects, these fast-track projects. And the main problems here are really siting and mitigation, conflicting land use, and then cost and financing, right? We need to cost it, we need to approve the sites, get the permits, and look at the environment. In general, there's a very strong discomfort amongst the NGOs. Things go too fast, don't have enough time to really think about it, are very worried about creating a precedent that then later can be used but could be very harmful. Okay? So they're trying to push back. Because of this pushback, there's a frustration amongst industrial developers. Saying, hey, well, we just want to build something now, otherwise our industry will collapse. And then there's exhaustion at the agencies, because they're used to maybe doing a couple of these projects per year, and now all of a sudden they've got this incredible backlog. Okay? So very interesting to put all these people together and see if they want to have a cup of coffee, after talking for a couple of hours. But it turned out fine. Now, in the near and medium term, you can maybe see some science and some role for a place like Stanford creeping in. So then people said, well, near medium term, we really should look at transmission, planning, timing, cost allocation, and so on. We really need to think about regulatory frameworks. Now, how should we design it? And one of the things that we really need to be able to do is coordinate between the federal level, the regional level, and the state levels. Right now, there's no coordination. And when you start thinking about these very large-scale projects, maybe that one project is built in Arizona, but is supplying the Los Angeles Valley. Now, so Nevada or Arizona and California then actually need to communicate and speak the same language, and at this moment they don't. They don't have the same regulations, don't have the same laws, don't have the same cost structures, and so on. Education came up as a really big thing. Generally, it was found that policymakers, general public, and so voters, right, and for NGOs, getting public support is also very important. They had very little knowledge of large-scale solar, didn't understand the impact. So education is a big thing. And then the other thing is that really we need to think about this level playing field. Is it fair to say large-scale solar costs me 20 cents per kilowatt hour and coal is 4 cents, and then say it's not cost competitive? Are we comparing the same things? Is the equity, the capital structure that we can get for large-scale solar as attractive as the capital structure that we could get for a nuclear power plant? Right? What about external costs? As you know from all the seminars you've listened to here, we do not have a good way to compare these apples and pears, right? And to really think about this. In the long term, there's more research questions, right? Improving the technology, size of installation, scalability. Can we improve technology to bring the cost down? Looking at intermittency and storage issue was not seen as an immediate problem or even an intermediate problem. It's for later. And then we have the very interesting research questions about integration of intermittent renewable energy project like this into our transmission system, and therefore lots of optimization questions. Now, one of the reasons why people are so nervous right now is, as I said, because 2010 seems to be sort of the make or break year. And the one model project that is now used to try out a lot of new things and to make these decisions on is Ivanpah. It's the furthest along. And BrightSource is leading this, and we know the people from BrightSource very well. And they really have to fight a lot of these first battles. You can just sort of imagine if you're the first project going through, you're facing a lot of these hurdles and you have to somehow try to clear them. And so let me just tell you a little bit about Ivanpah. Ivanpah is near the Nevada border, very close to I-15. It was really chosen with this idea that it's not in a protected area. It's as close as possible to areas that are certainly not very environmentally attractive. For example, it's very close to a natural gas power plant. There are casino outlet malls here. There is a large area of off-road vehicle recreation use close by. Water may not be such an issue. There's a golf course right next door. It's not too far from transmission lines. And so they really try to get this side relatively nicely. Still, in all of this negotiation, there were a lot of compromises that they had to make. And I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the things that were going on. First of all, they could never have gotten permission or through as far as they are if they had done wet cooling. We'll think a little bit about that later. They have dry cooling, so they use very little water. They really had to reduce the plant size by 23% in this process, reduce land use by 12%. They had to avoid the highest rare plant density. They were talking about translocating tortoises. They had to reduce the number of tortoises they were going to translocate by 15%. They had to reduce the number of towers from 7 to 3 because of NIMBY and other environmental objections. Heliostats were reduced by 45,000, so that just shows you how many they have. Okay, there's thousands of them. They really had to try to avoid grading and large rock removal. And as a consequence of this, they've been going down from 440 megawatts to about 392. Many negotiations in trying to deal with this. So let's look at some of these issues. I mentioned that Ivanpah needed to be dry cooling because wet cooling, now as you see we need a cooling tower, so obviously we're going to be using water because we have a thermal plant. And that's an issue that's brought up a lot. So I want to put this in a couple of slides just quickly in perspective a little bit. So here are lots of power generation mechanisms. We have nuclear, we have natural gas, we've got lots to do with coal, supercritical coal, subcritical coal, coal with carbon sequestration, supercritical coal with carbon sequestration, and so on, geothermal, and compare them in terms of the gallons used per megawatt hour with solar thermal tower wet cooling, solar thermal trough, and solar thermal dry cooling. Obviously, dry cooling is very little. Wet cooling is comparable to coal. Okay? And then, of course, the argument that's made, and it's good to think about it, is that yes, but this is in very dry areas, so it is not that much water available, so we really cannot afford this. But then we looked at this actually in a course that I taught last quarter a little bit more, because we are in an area, Central Valley, Mojave Desert and so on. It's close to agricultural area that are heavily irrigated, so it's kind of nice to see how would this compare to irrigated farmland. We're using a lot of water to irrigate crops that are very water intense in a very deserty-like area. So that's interesting. And we have a golf course right next to Ivanpah. That uses a lot of water. So how does that compare? So here are some other comparisons. The numbers are a little bit hard to see, but these are all sorts of crops. I have an alfalfa crop grown, for example, in San Joaquin Valley, in the Imperial Valley, close to that area. I've got corn. We've got citrus here. These are orchards, deciduous orchards, and this is solar energy. Okay? And now it's all done in gallons per acre per year. And so compared to crops, even wet cooling is not that high. Here's the golf course. It's about this high. Okay? So in terms of per acre per year, a golf course uses much more than a solar plant. The other thing that we looked at, which I was really interested in, is that, well, how much water is this anyway compared to all the rest that we're using? So let's do something very simple. We look at per capita water use in the Southwest, maybe Southern California particularly, and see what people spend water on. And then we look at, if I use electricity or I use other energy, obviously that was generated through some sort of energy generation scheme that uses water. So if I look at how much water I consume, how much of that actually is for water, for energy production. So here are some numbers. So per person in Southern California, we use about 74,000 gallons of water per year. 58% of that is outdoor usage. That is water, garden watering, and swimming pools. Okay, 58%. So say 40,000 gallons per year we use for our lawns and our swimming pools. We use about 4,300 gallons per year for energy production when you do the conversion. Okay? So that's just over 12% or so of what we use for our lawns and our swimming pools. If we were to install, to meet the renewable portfolio standards, 30% of our electricity coming from solar with wet cooling, how much would that add to what we have right now? And that's about 500 gallons per year per person compared to toilet flushing at 8,000 or clothes washing at 6,500 or the 40,000 for our gardens. No, to me that just means that, hey, if we have a water problem, it's not wet cooling that gives us that problem. Okay? We should really do something about our personal usage then. Now, the other interesting thing that is coming up because of the Ivanpah project, and some of you have probably seen this, is this interesting InterSolar argument right now. Ivanpah was in front of the California Energy Commission for the permitting process, and the distributed generation rooftop PV people actually argued against Ivanpah because they said we shouldn't have large-scale solar. We can do everything with rooftop PV. And in fact, that argument is also been discussed in the media. So some of you may have seen newspaper articles about this. And it's a very interesting question. Unfortunately, there are not really any good studies right now on the basis of which you could either win or lose in this. Okay? Very different things. We have rooftop PV, distributed generation, many smaller systems in or near load centers, generally in areas where we have a lower quality insulation that is not very good for these concentrated solar power systems because they really cannot deal with diffuse light very well. And then we have large-scale solar, fewer, larger systems, often in remote locations, so you have transmission line there, and we generally need high-quality insulation. Very different things. This can be combined, these are big systems, can be combined with storage, with ultimately the goal of providing base load. Okay? And these are different types of systems. So when you start thinking about this, there's a couple of things that make this, these arguments so intense right now. One of the main reasons was competition for equity. What happened, in, for example, in California, that the CEC, the California Energy Commission, said, we have a renewable portfolio standard. We want to meet a certain percentage with rooftop, distributed generation, solar, and a certain percentage with large-scale solar. That percentage was in favor of large-scale solar, was 70% versus 30%. Okay? Then the equity providers, you know 2009, and it's still difficult, was a very difficult year to get equity for a large project. Now, if you're an equity provider and you can choose between many, many small systems that you can sponsor, you know, a lot of administrative overhead and so on, or one big, say, $1 billion investment, you would find that $1 billion investment probably nicer. So there was competition for equity. Who was going to get the little equity that was available? Okay? So this was a major thing. And then people started arguing about, well, rooftop solar can do everything. We can grow. They said, well, how about integration? Is there a threshold above which you can't really integrate before you have to rebuild your local power systems also? So lots and lots of debates about that. So now, very interesting part of all of this. Okay, so let's let's talk about what came out and what sort of ideas were brought forward. And I'll do this per stakeholder. So first industry, then NGO, and then talk about what we can do here at Stanford, okay? So industry, wrapping up in this forum, it was very funny in a way, but it was very telling. They had sort of two main statements. One is, please help get these pipeline projects done and help them succeed, because then we'll have an industry. If those pipeline projects fail, we won't have a large-scale solar industry in the United States. It's just not going to happen. Okay, so please help. And then the other thing is that they said, we just want to get to a place where we don't get sued. Okay, so we just want to have some support from some of the NGOs in trying to see if we can make this work. But this is what they want to work on. You've already seen regulatory frameworks. They really are dying to have clear market mechanisms that can provide eco-incentives for industry to succeed. Okay? Much more than we have right now. There's very little, of course, at the moment. They would want to work on integration, storage development. They said we really need to get recognized forums of exchange where stakeholders can come together. They can come to a conclusion together or make a decision together, and it's actually recognized by policymakers and something is done with it. At the moment, that doesn't really exist. There's a lot of information that is missing. You know, I just mentioned distributed generation versus large-scale solar, but there's so much, you know, impacts on biology, sort of site optimization data that you need for site optimization to collect it all together and provide it in one database so you can do these sort of studies. It's not there, so they really want to work together with NGOs and with academia on this. And then also they really want to go and do education and advocacy. When you look at the NGOs, some of it was really the same. So here are the regulatory frameworks again. They particularly looked at things like, well, how do we make a decision whether or not the project is acceptable? Go, no go, screening criteria, modeling, survey protocols. All of these things really need to be put in place. Monitoring of existing projects in these pipeline projects is very important. Of course, they want dollars. They don't have enough of that. It's very hard for some of these NGOs to operate right now. They said we really need a regional perspective. We need to get away from local perspectives and state perspectives. We need to look at it as the Southwest, right, and get some uniformity. Again, they want partnerships. Okay, so this was really great. All of these stakeholders wanted to form these formal partnerships. And again, they wanted to collect key information. In particular, they mentioned mapping tools, like ArcGIS tools. You can go in and look at the overlap of data. You're saying, well, I want a DNI that is this much, this close to transmission lines. I wanted government-owned land. I want certain grade. Now find me optimal sites, these sort of optimization routines. And there is a lack of economic and biological data in particular. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this. Okay, so what we said is, whoa, we can do lots of really great stuff, okay? Because we were sitting around hearing all these things, and there's so many research questions that came up and things that we can do. So, as a result of this forum, we, or I, at the moment it's just me with lots of ideas, and then other faculty members that said that they would join, but we haven't formalized it yet. We're starting SALS, Stanford University, it should have been 2 S's, LargeScale Solar Center, okay? And this is a little Freudian mistake because a SAL is a little plow, right? So SALS also means that we're breaking ground for large-scale solar. Isn't that cute? Okay, so we start SALS. Now, and here are things that we can do, okay? First of all, there's a lot to do with site selection, helping with this, high quality, key data collection, it's not enough, mapping tools, optimization tools, site design guidelines based on scientific principles. All of this does not exist. Wonderful projects. We have a lot of work for people here in the policy and legal areas. We need clear interstate policy and regulatory frameworks. Hey, we've done this for other industries, right? I think for oil and gas industry, we've done it. We've done it for coal. Maybe we can learn some lessons from those and really have a look at that. Market mechanisms, really these looking at eco-incentives, but focused on ecosystem services. Lots of optimizations, right? Optimization of large-scale solar projects, large-scale solar and distributed generation assessments. Let's just figure it out once and for all. How much rooftop do we have available? What are the costs really? There's a lot of conflicting information out there. Storage development, right, for the long term. And of course, education, which we're good at, dissemination of knowledge to stakeholders and general public, and provide continued forms of exchange. It worked well here to get these people together. And we've heard afterwards also feedback from people that said, look, we met the same participants again a week later at a discussion that we had at the CEC, for example, and we actually got along better than before, right? So I said to BrightSource, well, hey, if you don't get sued now, and you're saving $10 million because you don't get sued, you know, what's our interest? Give us some research support, right? Okay, so now last thing, what you can do. Okay, if you're interested in large-scale solar, just want to point out a few things. First of all, I did start a new course on large-scale solar. We ran it in last winter. It's Energy 10828. We'll run it again next year in winter. I will also be teaching continuing studies course on large-scale solar in the winter of 2011. So for those of you who are not registered students, you can go there. We've started developing a website with information. Here's the website link. I wanted to point out there's a couple of opportunities for summer internships with some large-scale solar industries. And so if you're a student and you're interested in those, particularly right now, I'm looking for students with an MBA background. Okay? We're looking at financial, people with some financial expertise. We're hoping to really build cells and start RA ships. One of the things I just wanted to urge you is really support responsible LSS development. I think it is true that if we don't succeed this year, then we won't see that solar industry in the States. It will be there in China, for sure, and in Europe, but we just won't have it. And we take donations, so you can support cells as well. Okay, so I'll leave you with that. And if you have any questions, I have some time to answer. Yep.
I just have a really quick one. In the LSS category, you primarily focus on the CSP technologies, even though you mentioned first solar as one of the slides. Where do you see the future of PV in the large scale sort of format? Is it just not going to pan out economically?
No, I think it will. I mean, if you looked at the projects that were suggested, First Solar is definitely in this area, but not just First Solar, BP Solar as well, SunPower, Suntech, they're all really trying these very large-scale PV systems. The cost right now is not as attractive as CSP, okay? But they're working on this. And I think that especially if they manage to get a lot of these things installed fast in China, you know, they're talking about this 2 gigawatt system, but there's many others, many other systems that are in the pipeline. So I think this year, when you check the newspaper, you will see, you know, 1 gigawatt system after another being suggested there. That will drive the cost down, and they will get experience, and I'm sure that we'll see more of that here too.
So if I may rephrase it slightly, I realize there's a lot of stuff in the pipeline, but I figured you've probably done more than just back-of-the-envelope calculations. But what's your general assessment, or if you had the crystal ball, do you think that is going to pan out?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, of course it's different, right? I mean, whether you prefer a thermal plant, you know, a highly efficient thermal plant versus an electricity producing plant is different. But there will be room for all of it, I'm sure. If I had money, right, if they paid me more and I actually had money to invest in some of it, I probably would invest right now in a CSP company, just because they're a little bit further along. But then I've invested most of my money in oil and gas, so, you know.
Could you comment on the role of the policies in China and India as well as in Germany, which has impacted all of this area?
Yeah.
How will it affect your comment about the 2010 to the
Yeah, so the situations are all very different. In China, there is a lot of money available right now. Just to give you one example, in July I'm going to China to talk to a forum of Chinese mayors of the biggest 30 cities. And the mayors there are chosen a little bit different than here. They're often also very strong business leaders. And they're putting together, in the next couple of years, 500 billion per year for a period of, well, they say now 5 years. I don't read Chinese, so I couldn't quite figure it out. But I think 5 years, at least 2.5 trillion for developments just for these cities. So that is not Chinese federal, right? That is just the cities. So I think they will be investing a tremendous amount of money, and it's relatively easy there to go through permitting processes, right? That's the advantage of having that system, right? So this is one of the reasons why I always joke that what we need here is a friendly dictator, right? A smart, friendly dictator to make those decisions. So, but it's very different in Europe. In Europe, what Germany has done and what Spain has done, Solar Millennium is one of the biggest solar companies, is German. And then Abengoa, for example, is Spanish. And they really wanted to support those industries. And also they're very strong, especially in Germany with the Greens, were very strong in their Congress and really wanted to put in incentives. So both of these countries have feed-in tariffs. Right? And this is one of the reasons why large-scale solar was, well, smaller systems were done in Germany and implemented at such wider scale. So if you're looking at PV systems in Germany, distributed generation, they're very far ahead of anybody in terms of PV area per capita, right? And in Spain, a lot of these large-scale solar projects were really promoted because of the feed-in tariff. And the feed-in tariff right now is close to 25 euro cents per kilowatt hour, so that's a lot. Now, it's not working so great now because, of course, when you had the 2009 downturn, this is where people start to immediately quibble about.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.